Hello, I'm Mike Vinsel. Today I'm going to continue reading my book, Travels with Nobody. Uh, Stephen Stroh recalls America in the early 1980s. Okay, and so this is going to be chapter 20, which begins on page 338. It's a long chapter, so I'm going to divide it in half. I'm going to read up to page 156 today, and then I'll continue the rest of that chapter some other time. Anyway, today is September 23rd, 2024. And here we go. Chapter 20, Coming Home. That's the end of that story. Here in Japan, almost 4 decades later, Fusako and I are looking forward to the cherry blossoms by the pond when they will be in full bloom. We will have a Hanami picnic by the pond. Hanami means flower viewing in Japanese. It is my favorite festive occasion in Japan. This will be our first Hanami season in many years without Masa, my old fishing buddy. I never did tell how I resolved the cutoff of that friendship, or even what the final transgression was that made me cut him off. One more peculiarity about him that I left out was that over the years of our friendship, I had never met his wife, not even seen her. I didn't even know her name. On the few occasions I had met his 2 sons, they had avoided greeting me. They would never greet me until I had forced it by greeting them. I suppose they had inherited their father's social skills. About 6 years ago, Masa told me he had quit his job with the tax agency. He had been passed over for a promised promotion, and so had decided to quit and go into business for himself as a tax accountant. He told me that he had been inspired by my success in running my own school. If that was the case, I worried for him. I had chosen to start my own school because that was the best of limited options for English teachers in Japan. The other options would have been to teach at a college or a high school, but those jobs are done on 3-year contracts. I know many people who have been teaching at prestigious universities, but every 3 years their contracts can be renewed or not renewed. There is no tenure track, no pension. I don't make nearly as much money as I would have had I done that, but I do okay, and I can continue as long as students will have me. So it has worked out well for me. But Masa was throwing away a career at which he had spent his entire adult life. He was 58 years old when he quit. I worried for him, but over the years his new business grew into a success. I'm glad for that. But I noticed that as his business had grown, and it became clear that he probably made a lot more money than I did, I began to notice a change in his attitude, subtle cues in his choice of words that indicated that our social position had changed. Now, instead of being 2 buddies who like fishing, I was being relegated to the status of a guest, receiving the benefits of his generosity. He owned the Toyota Land Cruiser and the boat, after all. After he had begun to exceed what his salary was as an agent had been, he began an affair with one of his clients, a rich lady. He would tell stories of it while I would be driving on our way to fishing. That began a few years ago. I had never told Fusako. It was not my business anyway. But I was not comfortable having to keep his secret. I did object to his making sexual overtures to Fusako's friends at our barbecues. The case I mentioned before, where the woman, a friend of Fusako and me, would not repeat the words, her name was Yuko, happened to be after I knew Masa was already having an affair. Yuko had told us about that on a Saturday night while she, Fusako, and I were having drinks at a restaurant. The next weekend, Fusako would be away on business. I would go see Masa and ask him what exactly he had said to Yuko. It was the following Friday. I went to Masa's office with beer, as we had done many times. We sat down and opened our beers, and I broached the subject as diplomatically as I could. Masa, last week Yuko told Fusako and me at our barbecue 2 weeks ago you had said something to her that was kind of weird. She was kind of upset, I told him. He raised his eyebrows, awaiting further explanation. I asked her to tell me what it was exactly that you said, but she wouldn't tell me. She said that ladies don't use those kinds of words, I said, continuing, so I just want to know exactly what you said to her. I didn't say anything to her, he said. I see, I said. At the barbecue, he had spent some time talking with Yuko. I had seen that, but I could see that my question had angered him. He reached for his cell phone. What are you doing? I asked. Calling her, he said, scowling. Don't do that. Put your goddamn phone away, I told him. Fusako, Yuko, and I were members of a singing club. I would see Yuko the following night at the studio and clarify the situation. I explained this to Masa, and he put his phone away. The next night I did see Yuko. She told me not to worry about it. Okay, don't worry about it. She didn't tell me what Masa had said. She just told me not to worry about it. That didn't give me anything to work with. The following day, a Sunday, I met Masa for beers at a park. I told him that Yuko had said not to worry about it, so I guess he was off the hook. But then, Masa, leaning back on the bench, looking at me with the expression of a card player about to play the winning hand, took out his cell phone. Slowly, he tapped the screen with a sly grin that perhaps he had used in his days as a tax agent when he had finally cornered a tax cheat. He held his phone for me to listen to an audio recording. I listened. It was quiet at first, but then it became clear what it was, a woman moaning in sex. I take it that is you and your lady friend? I said. He nodded. I have no need for Yuko, or any of Fusako's friends. She's not my type, he said. I played along. Ah, Masa, bringing happiness to the world, I said. We finished our beers and walked back toward my house, which Masa had to pass on his way home. It was an uncomfortably quiet walk. I went over the situation in my mind. He had presented that recording to me as exculpatory evidence, proof that he could not be hitting on Fusako's friends because he was already occupied with his client. What it actually proved was that Masa had secretly recorded a lover in the most intimate of all situations and played it to his fishing buddy. He did that. To me, that meant that the depths of his depravity and scorn for women were unfathomable. Masa tried to break the silence by bringing up a subject on which he must have figured we would agree. So what do you think of that bitch, Greta Thunberg? He asked. I had had enough. I think she's one of the great heroes of the world. How the hell can you have a problem with her? I told him. I have not spoken to Masa since that day. That was the end of that friendship. But I still had to return the motor and the few other things of his that I had at my house. I supposed that I would have to see him when I returned them, but that would surely be an uncomfortable situation. I told Fusako the whole story. She came up with a plan. She made lunch reservations for a day or two after Christmas at a fancy hotel near Masa's house. She had made a nice card inviting him and his wife to join us for lunch as a couple. She worded it such that Masa would know that if his wife did not attend, the plan would be canceled and our relationship would be over. If his wife did attend, given past events that Masa had witnessed, Fusako could be counted on to talk freely of things that she knew were secrets Masa's wife did not know. Fusako is not afraid to make a scene in public, and Masa knew that. She put the invitation in a nice envelope. The motor was a Suzuki 2-horse, The whole thing, motor, stand together, was still light enough for me to carry. So on Christmas Eve morning at 4 o'clock, we got up, got dressed, and in the darkness I carried the motor. Fusako brought the envelope, and we walked to Masa's house, about 30 minutes away. We stopped periodically to rest. When we got close to his house, we kept quiet, walked to his driveway, and I silently placed the motor next to another motor he has on a stand that I had built. Fusako taped the envelope to the motor, and we slipped away back home in the morning twilight. That afternoon, Masa called on the phone. He said that unfortunately he and his wife had other plans for that day and would not be able to attend. So that was it. That was the last communication I had with him, 3 months ago now. Fusako and I have lived in Japan since the fall of 2001. As I mentioned before, life in Massachusetts had been a struggle. That 1 6-pack of Hamm's beer every Saturday night was our only luxury. We could drink beer and make Chinese dumplings from scratch. We still remember those times as having been of great value to us in later life. The job at the mental health facility paid slightly above minimum wage with no benefits but colossal responsibility. The job required and provided training for licensure to administer prescription medications. These were serious antipsychotics, clozapine, risperidone. One mistake with those, a medical error, could easily be fatal. Luckily, I never made an error. I would get home from teaching at about 3 in the afternoon, spend 20 minutes or so with Fusako, and then leave for the night job and return at about 11:30 at night. Fusako started work at the bakery at 4 a.m. We would get up at 3:30, and I would drive her to work. Then I would go back home and do my lesson planning until it was time to go to the school. So I would get about 3 hours of sleep each night. Fusako began to worry that I was working myself to death. She said that I snored terribly. She knew about sleep apnea and feared that one night she would wake up to find that she had become a widow. So one day in the summer, while I was teaching in the summer program at the school, I came home from work and found Fusako sitting on our bed, crying. I asked her what was wrong and tried to console her in the few minutes I had before I had to go to the night job. She dried her eyes and mustered her courage to ask me if we could move to Japan. She was afraid I would be reluctant. I told her we could. That was the summer of 2001. That August, she left for Japan. I stayed behind to close our apartment and get rid of our things. Fusako and her mother would find a place for us in Japan. At the end of August, I got the security deposit money back and left the apartment. I had a ticket on Air Canada to Nagoya, Japan from Boston, with a stop in Vancouver. The flight would leave Boston on Sunday morning, September 16th. I would spend the time before my flight visiting Rich Sanderson and his wife Cindy in Vermont. In 1999, they had bought an old farmhouse in Vermont and fixed it up. Fusako and I had visited them many times while we lived in Massachusetts. The most memorable time was when Rich and I cleaned out the pond on their property. A previous owner had kept a horse and had dumped the manure into the pond over a period of years, the worst possible thing she could have done with it. When they bought the place, the pond was completely covered with a thick mat of algae, so thick that, in parts, terrestrial plants were taking root in it. Rich pointed out that it was Spirogyra algae. So that was where the band got their name. I hadn't known it was a genus of algae. One weekend, Fusako and I drove up from Massachusetts to spend the weekend cleaning out the pond. Rich and I placed a large plastic recycling tub on the floor of his canoe. We sat in the seats facing each other, using lawn rakes to reach under the matted algae and lift it out of the water. The rakes were the perfect tool, acting as a strainer. We would lift the heavy slime, let it drain, and then slop it into the tub. It gave off the same sulfurous odor as a septic tank. When the tub was full, we would come ashore, lift out the tub, and dump it over the embankment and start again. The algae contained hundreds of leeches, salamanders, and the larvae of countless aquatic insects. While we did this disgusting work, Cindy and Fusako sat in lawn chairs drinking wine. Periodically, when we would come ashore, Fusako would meet us with a tray with shots of bourbon to fortify us. We worked all day, from dawn till dusk, on the first day, after which I was completely soused. We must have filled and dumped the tub 100 times. We called it a day when it was too dark to see. I puked and went to bed. Okay, here's a drawing of that time. There's Fusako and anyway, there's Rich and me in the pond, cleaning out the pond. That's right. That's Cindy and Fusako. Okay. That's right. I puked and went to bed. Fusako was not angry, though. The next morning, Rich and I got right back to work. By that afternoon, we had it done. The pond was clean. The water was remarkably clear, perhaps because the algae had prevented any sunlight from penetrating to the bottom. Most of the bottom was gravel. Only one corner was muck from the horse manure. The pile of algae we made was as big as a dump truck load. The pond was beautiful for years after that. That Sunday, before Fusako and I went back to Massachusetts, the four of us went fishing in a stream for trout to put in the pond. We caught 4 or 5 small brook trout, each about 4 inches long. We put them in a cooler full of water and brought them back to the pond. That must have been spring of 1999. For the next 2 summers, Fusako and I spent many weekends at Rich and Cindy's house. Rich had the pond stocked with rainbow trout, and together we all spent many afternoons fishing and enjoying drinks by the pond. This time, September of 2001, I didn't know when I would be back again. I had a wonderful visit, but I missed Fusako. My plan was to stay with Rich and Cindy, and then work my way down through New Hampshire, visiting friends along the way, and then I would stay at my father's house the night before I would fly out of Boston. I left Rich and Cindy's house on a Tuesday morning. It was early. I remember they both had to work. We said our long goodbyes in their driveway. They headed off to work. I headed down to Massachusetts to close out my bank account. After that, I would stay in Bradford, New Hampshire, with Russell Ford, a friend from my college days. That was my plan for the day. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. I remember driving down Interstate 91, heading for Massachusetts. I remember the song on the radio. They were playing "The Way" by Fastball. It seemed fitting for my situation. Left before the sun came up that day. Okay. Just past White River Junction, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get a cup of coffee. When I started driving again, there was no music. It seemed they had changed the program and were interviewing some movie director or actor who had made a movie showing the World Trade Center being hit by an airplane and burning. The speaker was describing how the plane hit the building from one side and fire and wreckage exploded out the other side. I expected he was about to explain how they were able to get that effect with all the effects they were coming up with. I wasn't interested in that. I switched the station to NPR. Funny, same thing. I switched around the radio stations and found that they all were talking about this same movie. But it wasn't the same movie star talking. It was quite irritating. What was going on? I figured I'd keep it on NPR. Okay, just a second. I'm going to have a sip of coffee here. Okay, that's right. I figured I'd keep it on NPR. That seemed to have the most likely prospect of having something on worth listening to. This interview went on forever. Then somebody else interrupted the interview. From NPR News in Washington, I'm Gene Cochran. 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York this morning, about 20 to 30 minutes apart. Black smoke has been pouring out of huge holes in the upper portions of the buildings. There has been no immediate word on injuries or fatalities. NPR's Larry Abramson has been following the story. The reports kept coming in. It went on through the day. That was 9/11, September 11th, 2001. I got to Massachusetts, closed out my bank account, withdrawing the last few hundred dollars. Then I headed up to New Hampshire to Russell's house. He was renting a house on Lake Todd in Bradford. He had a motorboat that he kept on the lake. He met me at the driveway as I pulled in. "Jesus, Stevie, that's fucked up. The World Trade Center gone," he said. "No doubt. Crazy bad." "Good to see you," I said. We went inside and watched the updates on CNN. We both sat slack-jawed looking at the TV. I was done driving for the day. Russ went to the fridge and got us beers. The news reports kept coming in. Another friend of ours, Ron Comrie, showed up. Russ had put out the word that I was going to be at his house before I headed out to Japan. I had my fishing gear in the pickup. I had several homemade lures that I'd carved. I wanted to try them out. The three of us got in the boat and motored around the lake, fishing and drinking beer. It was a beautiful fall afternoon. The foliage was just starting to turn color, but it was still warm enough for t-shirts. Ron caught a couple of nice bass and a pickerel, proof that my lures worked. I was happy about that, but was hoping that I would catch something too. It was great to be drinking beer on the boat with Russ and Ron. They were friends from way back. Ron had been friends with my brother Matthew back when they were in junior high school, when I had been just a kid. I met Russell in 1988. It was that fall that I had started at the University of New Hampshire. Yes, I finally got into college full-time. Russell had just graduated that June. He was a year older than me. We hit it off as friends right from the start. It was getting toward dusk when we were sneaking up on a patch of lily pads in a quiet section of the lake. I cast forward, a perfect cast, just to the edge of the edge of the pads. As soon as the lure hit the water, it disappeared in a swirl. I said, "Mississippi," and set the hook. It was a strong fish, definitely a bass. It lunged toward the cover of the lily pads. I held my rod out to the side to usher the fish in a different direction rather than risk the line snapping if I tried to muscle it back. It worked. I was able to get the fish into open water. It jumped and did a tail walk for about 10 feet, and then made a strong pull toward the bottom. I had lost many bass that were smart enough to swim under a sunken tree or some other structure to tangle the line. So I raised my rod tip toward the side to try to keep the fish off the bottom. I fought it for a solid minute, maybe 2. It darted away twice when I had been ready to bring it into the boat, but I didn't lose it. In the end, I brought it to the side of the boat, just enough tension to hold its head to the surface. I grabbed the lower lip, and there it was, possibly the biggest largemouth bass I had ever landed. It was 22 inches long. I released it. We motored slowly under a bridge to a section of the lake where there was a restaurant with a bar that had a dock for boat access. We tied up the boat and went in. We were in a celebratory mood. Catching those fish had taken our minds off the terrible news of that day, which had not really registered in our minds at the time. Inside the bar, they had turned off the TV in favor of dusting off an old jukebox that they had that still worked. Russ put on the Jimi Hendrix version of All Along the Watchtower. Ron had an interesting sense of humor. He always spoke slowly and deliberately, and when he would tell a joke, the vertical lines of his brow would knit in exaggerated seriousness. He had long brown hair, a goatee, and actually had a resemblance to common portrayals of Jesus. He turned to us, knit brow, serious, and in a deadpan, asked if we thought that song was actually an allusion to the spirituality of the Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, in the sense that George Harrison was singing about the Hare Krishnas in My Sweet Lord, he said. It took me a few seconds to get it. Oh yes, the Watchtower. I get it. Yes, I think that's what Dylan was doing. We laughed and got another round. After that, we had another and another until it was time to go. We went out to the boat, started it up, and motored away. We got to Russell's house okay. The next morning, we learned from CNN that all the airports in the United States were closed and would remain closed until further notice. CBS News reported that the hijackers were suspected by authorities to be supporters of Osama bin Laden. It occurred to me that I was not going to be able to fly to Japan on Sunday morning. What would I do? How long would the airports be closed? Throughout the day, updates came one after another, each one driving home the likelihood that not only were the airports going to remain closed, but this event was going to prove to be a watershed moment in history. Footage of the planes hitting the towers, the wreckage in the field in Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, was repeated through the day, punctuated by grim calculations of worst-case scenario casualty numbers in the thousands. The world had changed. I called my father on the phone. He said he didn't think the airports would be open by Sunday. Nobody knew how long it would be. Russell had noticed that they had mentioned that airports in Canada were still operating. "Stevie, your ticket is Air Canada, right?" he asked. It was. I must have mentioned that to him. "We'll drive up Saturday night, get a hotel, party all night, and get you to the airport first thing Sunday morning," he said. It was a good idea. That night, late enough that it would be morning in Japan, I called Fusako. Of course, she was aware of the situation. I told her our plan. I said I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get a flight from Montreal, but I'd try. I told her I would call when I could, when I was sure that I had a flight. She told me to call her once I get to Vancouver. Then she would have time to arrange being there to meet me at the airport in Nagoya. We agreed. I would call her from Vancouver. I called my father again to explain the situation. I was sorry I would not be able to stay with him before I left, but it was too far from his house to drive to Montreal. He understood. For Russell, it would be an adventure. Russell called two other friends, Ariel Aucoin and her fiancé, Dan Bales, to come over and hang out before we would go. I had known Ariel for several years at that time, but I had not met Dan. He seemed a nice enough person. He was only 21 years old. She must have been around 30. They had never been to Canada and wanted to go with us. I was okay with that at first. Russell solved another problem for me, which was what to do with the truck. He said he'd give me $1,000 for it. Done. I said. He got a pad of paper for me to write up a bill of sale. I told him I'd put it on his tab. I knew he'd be good for it one of these years. No need, Stevie. I can get the cash in the morning, he said. As the evening went on and we drank beer and talked, I became more and more irritated with Dan Bales. He was young, had never traveled, just a high school education, all fair enough, but he was full of platitudes about American greatness, that we stand for freedom, we were the first to free the slaves, and the like. He was indignant that Muslims would dare attack Americans. He had emphasized the word Muslims, raising the corner of his lip in a scowl when he said it, adding that we had to kick their ass to teach them a lesson, as if perhaps he expected that was a point on which we could all agree. I told him that President Bush would most likely respond with an attack on Afghanistan, and maybe even an invasion, but I said Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were not countries. If we attacked Afghanistan, we might topple the Taliban government, which I agreed might be a good thing, but it was likely that Al-Qaeda would slip into other countries if things got too rough in Afghanistan. I pointed out that the evolution of Al-Qaeda was quite a direct consequence of American actions in Afghanistan and the Middle East, particularly keeping troops in Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the Gulf War. That was, after all, what Bin Laden himself had said was the reason why he launched his war on America. He had made a public announcement, which was then followed by the attacks on the U.S. embassies in 1998, on the same day in Kenya and Tanzania. I had studied that. Dan would not hear any of it. America was a great country, the greatest country, he insisted, and this was a time when we all had to stand together. I found the conversation tedious. Dan had little knowledge on just what Al-Qaeda was, or who this Osama bin Laden was, or even a general outline of the history of American dealings in the Middle East. That was understandable. He was only 21. What irritated me was not the things he didn't know. That was, at the time, obscure history. But it was the things he knew for sure that were simply not true. I remembered the Mark Twain quote. I didn't say it out loud. What gets us into trouble is not what we don't know. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so. That's Mark Twain. Okay. Well, Dan became indignant that I would question the greatness of America. It was us who freed the slaves, he repeated. It was us who fought off the British and brought freedom to the world. It was us who saved Europe's ass in World War II, he said. And we didn't just sit there when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, I added. I didn't want to make Ariel uncomfortable, but Dan was persistent. He sought allies in Russell and Ariel. Where'd you find this guy? He said to them, rolling his eyes, pointing to me with his thumb. Then he looked at me. Sorry, dude, but you got a lot of learning to do, he said, shaking his head in pity. Well, that's one point on which we agree, I said, raising my beer in cheers. Russell intervened, telling them about the bass I had caught the night before. The friction between Dan and me didn't ruin the evening. Ariel drove when they left. As Russell and I saw them off, I was hoping that in the morning they would have forgotten about going to Montreal with us. I said so to Russell. He agreed that it would be best without them, but he couldn't actually disinvite them. That would be too harsh. I agreed with that. The next day, they had not forgotten. They would join us. Okay, so that's now we're at page 356. We're in the middle of chapter 19. And so I'm going to divide this up into two videos.